Before Marilyn Monroe ever sang Happy Birthday, a Swedish aristocrat named Gunilla von Post had already stolen JFK's heart. They met on the French Riviera just weeks before he married Jackie. Years later, risking his political life, he met her again to deliver a brutal confession. I love you, but I must choose the presidency. Gunilla is the undeniable proof that Camelot was not a fairy tale, but a cold political arrangement, and that John F. Kennedy knowingly traded his one true love for power. On the morning of September 12, 1953, the sun rose over Newport, Rhode Island, with the kind of brilliant, hard clarity that photographers pray for. It was a day that had been circled on the calendars of America's social elite for months. A date that promised not just a union of two people, but a merger of dynasties. To the casual observer standing outside the wrought iron gates of St. Mary's Church, the air buzzed with a festive, almost coronation-like electricity. The streets were lined with thousands of onlookers, held back by police barricades, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the motorcade. They were there to witness the wedding of the year, the day the handsome war hero Senator John Fitzgerald Kennedy would take the elegant, enigmatic Jacqueline Bouvier as his wife. It was the opening scene of the Camelot mythology, a tableau of wealth, youth, and power that would seduce the world for decades to come. Inside the church, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of gardenias and the heavy, hushed anticipation of 600 distinguished guests. The sunlight filtered through the stained glass, illuminating the 50 yards of ivory silk taffeta that made up Jackie's gown, a dress that would become an icon of mid-century fashion. Beside her stood Jack, bronzed from the sun, flashing that famous boyish grin that disarmed opponents and charmed voters in equal measure. To the world, he looked like a prince claiming his princess. He looked like the future. The cameras flashed, capturing the perfect smiles, the clasped hands, the seemingly unbreakable bond of a couple destined for the White House. But photographs are notorious liars. They capture the surface, the skin of the moment, but they cannot photograph the silence inside a man's heart. While the Archbishop of Boston intoned the solemn vows of marriage, and while the choir's voices soared into the vaulted ceiling, a ghost was present in the pews. It was not a literal spirit, but a specter of regret, invisible to the press, but weighing heavily on the soul of the groom. Because just weeks before this meticulously orchestrated spectacle, while the invitations were being embossed and the menu at Hammersmith Farm was being finalized, John F. Kennedy had sat down at his desk, picked up a pen, and poured his terrifyingly honest thoughts into a letter. That letter was not addressed to the woman standing beside him in white. It had been sealed, stamped, and sent across the cold expanse of the Atlantic Ocean to a quiet, leafy boulevard in Stockholm, Sweden. The recipient of that letter was Gunilla von Post. She was 21 years old, a stunning Swedish aristocrat with hair like spun gold and a spine of steel, a woman who possessed a quiet confidence that completely unnerved the ambitious senator. She was not there in Newport. She was thousands of miles away, living in a world far removed from the frenetic machinery of American politics. But in her hands, she held the paper that proved the lie of the Newport wedding. The letter was a confession, a desperate cry from a man who felt the walls of destiny closing in on him. In his sprawling, difficult handwriting, the future president of the United States had written a sentence that, had it been revealed on that September morning, would have shattered the Kennedy myth before it had even begun. If I had met you 1 week earlier, he wrote, I would have canceled everything. Canceled everything. It was a phrase of total negation. It implied that the wedding, the alliance with the Bouviers, the trajectory toward the presidency, all of it was negotiable. It suggests that the man standing at the altar, the man who would go on to lead the free world through the darkest days of the Cold War, was moments away from walking away from it all. This was not merely cold feet. This was a man looking into the abyss of a life he did not choose, seeing the only person who offered him an escape route. Gunilla von Post was not just a summer fling. She was the road not taken. Beyond the glossy retrospective of history lies a starker reality. In the summer of 1953, Jack Kennedy was not merely a rising star. He was a man in physical and emotional agony. His back, shattered during the war, was a source of constant, grinding pain. Underneath the tuxedo, he wore a rigid brace, a corset of canvas and steel holding him upright when his own spine failed him. He lived with the constant awareness of his own mortality, having received the last rites multiple times before the age of 35. When a man believes he is dying, he does not have time for polite fictions. He craves the truth, and Gunilla was his truth. The wedding reception at Hammersmith Farm was a masterpiece of political theater. 1,200 guests mingled on the terrace lawns overlooking Narragansett Bay. There was champagne, there was dancing, and there was the formidable figure of Joseph P. Kennedy Sr., the patriarch who had engineered this union as carefully as a corporate merger. Joe Kennedy watched his son with the satisfied look of an investor whose asset has just matured. To Joe, Jackie was the perfect component to complete the package: Catholic, cultured, multilingual, and socially impeccable. She was the final piece of the puzzle that would put a Kennedy in the Oval Office. But as Jack smiled for the newsreels, shaking hand after hand, his mind was arguably drifting back to a small, intimate restaurant in the south of France, to the scent of the Mediterranean, and to the sound of Gunilla's laughter. This story, the story of Gunilla von Post, has often been dismissed by protective historians as a footnote, a minor dalliance in a life filled with women. They categorize her alongside the starlets and the secretaries, the momentary distractions that Jack consumed to numb his physical pain and existential boredom. But this categorization is a fundamental misunderstanding of who Gunilla was and what she meant to him. She was the only woman Jack Kennedy ever explicitly tried to marry instead of Jackie. She was the only woman for whom he was willing to challenge the iron grip of his father. She was the only woman who made him question the very purpose of his ambition. The letter sent to Sweden was not a seduction. It was a eulogy for the life he wanted to live, written by the man who was about to bury it under the weight of duty. The tragedy of the Newport wedding is not that Jack Kennedy didn't love Jackie. In his own complicated, detached way, he developed a deep affection and admiration for her. But it was a love born of necessity, of shared burden, of public performance. It was a partnership of state. His love for Gunilla was something else entirely. It was elemental. It was a connection that existed outside of politics, outside of money, outside of the expectations of the American electorate. In Sweden, with Gunilla, Jack wasn't the senator. He wasn't the war hero. He wasn't the hope of the Democratic Party. He was simply a man, broken and beautiful, seeking solace in the arms of a woman who saw him, not his title. That is why the memory of her haunted him. That is why, even as he cut the wedding cake, the shadow of Gunilla stood between him and his bride. As the sun set on that September day in 1953, and the newlyweds prepared to depart for their honeymoon in Acapulco, the narrative of the perfect American couple was sealed. The newspapers ran the photos the next morning. The radiant bride, the dashing groom, the fairy tale come to life. The American public devoured it, hungry for a royalty of their own. They saw the start of a golden age. They did not see the invisible thread stretching from the bridal suite all the way to Stockholm. They did not know that the groom had left a piece of his soul in Europe. They did not know that the foundation of Camelot was built on a fault line, a fracture of the heart that would never truly heal. The honeymoon in Acapulco was meant to be the romantic culmination of the fairy tale. But behind the closed doors of the bridal suite, the silence was deafening. Jack, plagued by agonizing back pain, spent much of the trip bedridden, reading history books while his young bride sat quietly nearby, sketching or writing letters. It was here, in the supposed paradise of their union, that the cracks began to show. Jack was polite, he was charming, but he was absent. His body was in Mexico, but his mind was drifting. Witnesses later recalled that Jack seemed restless, possessed by a strange melancholy that did not fit the profile of a newlywed. He was a man who had done his duty. He had merged the dynasties. He had pleased his father. But as he looked out at the Pacific Ocean, he wasn't thinking about the future he had secured. He was thinking about the freedom he had surrendered. The ghost of the girl in France was not just a memory, she was a measurement of everything that was missing in this polished, perfect, and profoundly lonely marriage. She was the woman who stayed in the shadows, the Swedish guerrilla who held the heart of the American king. Beyond the scandal, beyond the headlines, lies the tragedy of a man who conquered the world but could not conquer his own destiny. The wedding was the beginning of his political ascent, but in a spiritual sense, it was the end of his personal freedom. The letter to Gunilla was the final testament of Jack Kennedy, the individual, before he was fully consumed by John F. Kennedy, the president. And so, as the motorcade drove away from St. Mary's Church, leaving the cheering crowds behind, the silence descended. Far away, in the cool Nordic air, Gunilla von Post read the letter again, and then put it away. She did not burn it. She did not tear it up. She kept it. She kept it because she knew even then that it was evidence. Evidence that for one fleeting, terrifying moment, the most powerful man of the century had been willing to throw it all away for love. She knew that history would record the wedding, but she held the truth. Gunilla von Post was an anomaly in Jack's life. Unlike the starlets and secretaries who bowed to his ambition, she was a creature of the iron butterfly mold, delicate in appearance, but forged from the hardest steel of European nobility. The stage was set. The tragedy had begun. The shadow in the wedding album was real, and her name was Gunilla. The gravitational pull Gunilla von Post exerted on John F. Kennedy was unlike anything else in his life. Throughout his rise to power, Jack was surrounded by women who were, by design or circumstance, subordinate to his ambition. Starlets, secretaries, and socialites were players in his game, eager to serve the great man. Gunilla von Post was an anomaly. She was a creature from a different world entirely, a world that did not bow to the Kennedy name simply because it had no need to. She was the iron butterfly, delicate in appearance but forged from the hardest steel of European nobility. Her story begins in Stockholm, Sweden in 1932. While America was in the throes of the Great Depression and bread lines stretched around city blocks, and while Germany was witnessing the dark rise of the Third Reich, Sweden stood apart. It was a nation of stoic neutrality, a fortress of calm in a continent about to catch fire. Gunilla was born into the von Post family, a lineage that did not merely possess money but history. In the stratified society of Northern Europe, the von Posts were an institution. They were the landed gentry, the custodians of tradition, deeply entrenched in the social registry of Scandinavia. This distinction is crucial. When Gunilla looked at Jack Kennedy later in life, she did not see a Prince of Camelot as the American press did. She saw a charming nouveau riche Irishman. To a daughter of the Swedish aristocracy, the Kennedy fortune, made in banking and bootlegging within a single generation, was impressive, certainly, but it did not command the instinctive reverence it did in Boston. She was born with the kind of status Jack was spending millions to acquire. Gunilla's childhood was a masterclass in insulated privilege and rigorous discipline. Stockholm in the 1930s and 40s was known as the Venice of the North, a city of pristine waterways, regal palaces, and a quiet, orderly rhythm of life. While the rest of Europe was being bombed into rubble during the Second World War, Gunilla's world remained largely intact, though not untouched by the somber reality of the conflict. She grew up with the specific, sober maturity of a child, watching the world burn from behind a pane of glass. This environment fostered a unique temperament, observant, composed, and deeply internal. She was not raised to be loud or to seek attention. In the Swedish ethos of Jantelagen, a cultural code that discourages individual boasting and emphasizes the collective, Gunilla learned that true worth did not need to announce itself. This quiet confidence would later act as a sedative to Jack's frantic, noise-filled life. As she blossomed from a girl into a young woman, it became clear that Gunilla was not destined for a small life. She possessed a striking, luminous beauty, the classic Nordic ideal with platinum blonde hair, high cheekbones, and eyes that held a piercing, intelligent blue. But her parents, aware that beauty without substance is a dangerous thing, ensured her education was formidable. She was sent to the prestigious École Lemania in Lausanne, Switzerland. The Swiss finishing school is a concept often misunderstood today. It was not merely about learning which fork to use or how to pour tea. For the daughters of the European elite, these schools were rigorous training grounds for diplomacy and social survival. At Lemania, Gunilla was not just taught etiquette, she was taught how to navigate the world. She mastered languages with the ease of a diplomat, becoming fluent in Swedish, German, French, and English. She studied art history, literature, and the complex web of European politics. She was trained to hold a conversation with a prime minister as easily as with a gardener. This education created a sharp contrast with the American debutantes Jacqueline Kennedy was accustomed to dating. The young women of the American social register in the 1950s were often raised with a singular goal: marriage. Their education was frequently superficial, designed to make them decorative assets to a husband's career. Gunilla, conversely, was raised to be an autonomous entity. She read the same books Jack read. She understood the geopolitical landscape of post-war Europe, not as a distant theory, but as her lived reality. When she spoke, she didn't just fill silence, she offered perspective. This intellectual parity was a potent aphrodisiac for Jack, a man who, despite his playboy reputation, was fiercely intelligent and often bored by women who could not challenge him mentally. Gunilla was a challenge. She was a puzzle he couldn't solve with a smile and a checkbook. By 1953, Gunilla was 21 years old. She had returned to Sweden from Switzerland, a polished, sophisticated young woman. But the orderly, predictable life of Stockholm began to feel stifling. The path laid out for her was clear: marry a suitable Swedish nobleman, manage a household, raise children, and grow old with dignity. It was a safe path, but Gunilla had a streak of wanderlust, a desire to taste the world before the doors of domesticity closed forever. The war was over, Europe was rebuilding, and a new energy was pulsing through the continent. She wanted to see it. Against the mild protestations of her protective family, she made a decision that would alter the course of history. She decided to spend the summer in France. Her destination was the French Riviera, the Côte d'Azur. In 1953, the Riviera was not just a vacation spot, it was the epicenter of global glamour. It was where Picasso painted, where Hemingway drank, where Hollywood royalty mingled with exiled European monarchs. It was a place of sensory overload, the blinding blue of the Mediterranean, the scent of jasmine and pine, the roar of Alfa Romeos on winding coastal roads. It was the hangman's drop for the cautious, a place where inhibitions went to die. Ganila's journey south was a symbolic shedding of her Nordic reserve. She packed her trunks with the fashionable couture of the day, cinched waists, full skirts, silk scarves, and boarded the train. As she watched the landscape shift from the gray-green forests of Scandinavia to the sun-drenched vineyards of France, she felt a sense of liberation. She was traveling to learn French, to soak up the culture, to experience the joie de vivre that was so absent in the stoic North. She was not looking for a husband. She was certainly not looking for a complication. She was looking for freedom. Gunilla was not a naive tourist. She was 21, but she carried herself with the poise of someone much older. She wore an aristocratic armor, that invisible shield of politeness and distance that protects women of her class. She arrived in Cannes in August, the peak of the season. The city was throbbing with life. The hotels were full, the casinos were glittering, and the beaches were a tapestry of parasols. Gunilla settled into the rhythm of the Riviera. She spent her mornings studying French, her afternoons swimming in the warm sea, and her evenings dining with friends from the international Set. She was a woman in bloom, radiantly alive, completely self-possessed. She moved through the crowds of Cannes with a cool detachment, turning heads but rarely turning her own. She was enjoying the solitude of being a stranger in a strange land, the anonymity that allows one to reinvent oneself. Little did she know, the machinery of fate was already grinding into motion. While Gunilla was perfecting her French vowels in a sunlit cafe across the ocean, a young senator from Massachusetts was boarding a plane. John F. Kennedy was tired. He was in pain. He was feeling the crushing weight of his father's expectations and the looming inevitability of his wedding to Jacqueline Bouvier. He needed an escape. He needed a final breath of air before the suffocation of political life took hold completely. He chose the south of France. The collision course was set. On one side, the iron butterfly, young, independent, culturally sophisticated, and emotionally guarded. On the other, the American prince, charismatic, physically broken, politically ambitious, and emotionally starving. They were two comets hurtling toward the same point in space and time. The backdrop was the most romantic coastline on Earth. The timing was disastrously perfect. Ganilla's life up to this point had been a preparation, though she did not know it. Her strength, her languages, her refusal to be impressed by status, these were the very qualities that would ensnare Jack Kennedy. He had met hundreds of beautiful women. He had never met anyone like Gunilla. As August 1953 dawned over the Mediterranean, the stage was set for a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. The girl from the north was about to meet the boy from the west, and the resulting spark would threaten to burn down the White House. The night of the collision was a warm, velvet dark evening in August 1953. The location was the Hotel du Cap Eden Rock in Antibes, just a short drive from Cannes, a sanctuary of white stone and manicured gardens that had hosted the Lost Generation and was now playing host to the new masters of the universe. The air was heavy with the scent of pine needles and the salty tang of the Mediterranean, mixed with the expensive aromas of cigars and Shalimar perfume. It was a setting so perfectly curated for romance that it felt almost theatrical, a stage set waiting for its principal actors to arrive. Gunilla von Post was dining with her friends. She was wearing a simple but elegant blue dress that accentuated her eyes and the pale gold of her hair. At 21, she possessed a radiance that was almost incandescent, a vitality that drew the eye even in a room filled with the most beautiful women in Europe. She was laughing, her head thrown back, a glass of white wine in her hand, utterly at ease in her skin. She was not scanning the room. She was not looking for anyone. She was simply existing in the moment, enjoying the freedom of a summer night in France. Then the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was a subtle change, a ripple of energy that often accompanies the arrival of someone significant. Two men entered the dining terrace. One was tall, athletic, and moved with a confident stride. Torbert "Torby" MacDonald, a former football star. But it was the man beside him who commanded the room's attention, even though he moved with a noticeable pained stiffness. It was John F. Kennedy. He was tanned a deep mahogany from the sun, his hair a thick, unruly shock of chestnut, his smile a blinding flash of white that seemed to promise intimacy to everyone it touched. But to the observant eye, he was a man in distress. He leaned heavily on the table as he sat down. His movements were careful, guarded. At 36, he was already a senator, already a war hero, and already physically broken. But the charisma, the sheer magnetic force of his personality, was undimmed. Jack's eyes scanned the terrace. He was a man with a restless gaze, always searching, always assessing. And then he stopped. Across the crowded room, through the haze of cigarette smoke and the flicker of candlelight, he saw her, the girl in the blue dress. According to later accounts, Jack didn't just notice her. He was arrested by her. He nudged Torby MacDonald. "Who is that?" he asked. There was an urgency in his voice that went beyond the casual interest of a bachelor on holiday. He stared at her with a naked intensity that was almost rude. Gunilla, feeling the weight of a gaze upon her, turned. Their eyes locked. In that split second, amidst the clatter of silverware and the murmur of French conversation, the world seemed to narrow down to a single line of sight. Jack wasted no time. Caution was not a luxury he could afford. His time was short, both on this trip, and he believed in life. He sent a waiter to her table with a note, or perhaps he simply walked over. The accounts vary slightly, but the outcome was the same. He needed to know her. The introduction, however, began with a misunderstanding that would become the cornerstone of their intimacy. The noise of the jazz orchestra was loud. The room was boisterous. When Gunilla introduced herself, extending her hand with aristocratic politeness, she said, "I am Gunilla." Jack, perhaps deafened by the music, or perhaps simply disarmed by her beauty, blinked. A puzzled smile spread across his face. "Gorilla?" he asked. "Did you say gorilla?" For a moment, the interaction hung in the balance. It was a ridiculous, almost slapstick error. A lesser woman, insecure or vain, might have been insulted. To be compared to an ape by a strange American in a tuxedo? It was absurd. But Gunilla von Post did not take herself that seriously. She looked at this handsome, deaf American, and she burst into laughter. It was a genuine, full-throated laugh that dissolved all pretension. "Yes," she teased, playing along, "I am the Swedish gorilla." Jack threw his head back and laughed with her. The tension broke. The ice shattered. In that moment of shared absurdity, they ceased to be a senator and a noble woman. They became two young people sharing a private joke in a crowded room. From that night forward, in their most secret letters and whispered phone calls, he would always be Jack, and she would be his Swedish gorilla. It was a nickname that stripped away her title and his office, a password to a secret world where they could just be themselves. He asked her to dance. Moving to the dance floor was a physical trial for Jack. Every step was a negotiation with pain. But he held her close, masking his infirmity with the grace of a man who refuses to be pitied. Gunilla later recalled the sensation of dancing with him. He was not the robust, powerful figure he appeared to be in photographs. Under his jacket, she could feel the tension in his frame, the fragility of his spine. She realized with a sudden pang of intuition that this man was suffering. This vulnerability hidden from the voters and the cameras triggered something profound in Gunilla. She didn't just feel attraction, she felt a protective instinct. She felt the weight he was carrying. They danced slow, close, the music wrapping around them. They talked, not about politics, not about the Cold War, not about the Senate. They talked about the sea, about Sweden, about the feeling of being young and lost. Jack was mesmerized. He had found a woman who didn't care about his polling numbers. He had found a woman who looked at him and saw the man, not the monument. But the night could not remain innocent forever. The shadow of reality was waiting to crash the party. As the evening wound down, perhaps while walking in the moonlit gardens of the hotel, or sitting on a quiet balcony overlooking the black water, the conversation deepened. The playfulness evaporated. Jack became somber. He looked at Gunilla, his eyes dark with a sudden, crushing sadness. He knew he had to tell her. To continue without speaking the truth would be cruel, and whatever faults Jack Kennedy had, he did not want to be cruel to this woman. He took her hand. His voice, usually so confident, dropped to a whisper. "I'm getting married," he told her, "in 3 weeks." The words hung in the air like smoke. Gunilla felt a physical blow. The magic of the evening, the spark of connection, the sudden rush of falling in love, it all collided with the brutal brick wall of facts. He was engaged. He was spoken for. He belonged to another woman and to a destiny that was already written. "Her name is Jacqueline," he continued. He didn't speak of love. He didn't speak of passion. He spoke of the wedding as if it were a train schedule, an event that was happening to him, not something he was doing. He explained the pressure from his father, the expectations of his career, the political necessity of a wife. He painted a picture of a life that was a golden cage. "I was swept off my feet," Gunilla wrote in her memoir decades later, describing that moment. But it was a romance born under a falling guillotine. She should have walked away. A prudent woman would have said good night, returned to her room, and packed her bags the next morning. She was 21. She had her whole life ahead of her. Why entangle herself with a man who was weeks away from the altar? But the heart is not prudent. And Gunilla saw the desperation in his eyes. She saw a man who was terrified of the lonely public life awaiting him. He wasn't asking for a fling. He was asking to be saved, if only for a few days. He looked at her with an intensity that burned. Then he delivered the words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. If he had met her just 1 week earlier, he would have canceled everything. It was a confession that walked the razor's edge between romantic tragedy and manipulative charm. A prudent woman might have doubted him, but looking into his desperate eyes, Gunilla believed him. She saw a man terrified of the lonely public life awaiting him. He wasn't asking for a fling. He was asking to be saved. Jackie was a project. Gunilla was a person. They spent the remaining days of his trip inseparable. They drove along the winding coastal roads of the Riviera, the wind in their hair, pretending that America didn't exist. They shared meals in small hidden bistros where no one knew who he was. They created a bubble of time, a stolen week where the rules of the real world were suspended. But the clock was ticking. The date of the wedding, September 12th, was approaching like a storm front. When the time came for Jack to leave, the separation was agonizing. They stood at the airport, or perhaps the train station. The exact location is less important than the emotion. Jack looked at her, his face etched with conflict. He was going back to marry a woman he admired but did not love, with this kind of fire. He was going back to shake hands, to kiss babies, to become a legend. He was leaving his heart in France. "I will return," he promised her. It is the oldest promise in the book. But as he boarded his plane, leaving the Swedish guerrilla standing alone on the tarmac, he was already plotting how to keep it. He went home. He stood at the altar in Newport. He said "I do" to Jacqueline Bouvier. He smiled for the cameras, but inside the pocket of his suit, or perhaps locked in the safe of his mind, was the memory of the blue dress, the laugh, and the girl who had seen the real Jack Kennedy. The affair of the heart had begun, and the marriage to Jackie was, from its very first breath, a crowded union. There were 3 people in the marriage now: Jack, Jackie, and the ghost of Gunilla von Post. For 2 years following the wedding in Newport, the relationship between the senator and the aristocrat existed entirely in ink and paper. It was a romance of the imagination, sustained by the fragile lifeline of the transatlantic mail service. While the world watched John F. Kennedy settle into his role as the dashing young husband of Jacqueline Bouvier, a very different narrative was unfolding in the private letters he sent to Stockholm. These were not the hurried notes of a busy politician. They were the confessions of a lonely man. But these letters were traveling through a dangerous world. What Gunilla did not know, and what Jack only feared in his darker moments, was that their romance was unfolding under the watchful eye of the American surveillance state. J. Edgar Hoover, the paranoid and powerful director of the FBI, kept extensive files on the Kennedy family. Every indiscretion, every overseas call, every letter to a foreign national was potential leverage. Consider the stakes. A United States senator, a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was sending emotional, compromising letters to a Swedish aristocrat during the height of the Red Scare. Had these letters been intercepted and leaked to the press or to Jack's political enemies, the scandal would have been categorized as a security risk. Jack wasn't just risking his marriage. He was risking a charge of moral turpitude that could have led to his expulsion from the Senate. Yet, he kept writing. The need to connect with Gunilla was so overpowering that it silenced the instincts of self-preservation that usually guided his every move. The early years of the Kennedy marriage were far from the fairy tale the public devoured in Life magazine. They were marked by profound physical suffering and emotional distance. Jack underwent catastrophic spinal surgery in 1954, a procedure so dangerous that he was given the last rites and spent months flat on his back, staring at the ceiling, contemplating his mortality. Jackie, though dutiful and present, was struggling with her own demons, including a heartbreaking miscarriage and the immense pressure of fitting into the Kennedy clan, who mocked her breathy voice and refined tastes. In this vacuum of pain and isolation, Gunilla von Post became Jack's psychological escape hatch. She was the fantasy of a simpler life. She was the road not taken. "I am anxious to see you," he wrote in one of his many letters. "Is it possible? I have a hunger for Sweden." The subtext was clear. He had a hunger for her. He wasn't just missing a woman. He was missing the feeling of being understood without the filter of politics. Gunilla, for her part, waited. She had returned to her life in Sweden, working in an office, dating appropriate men, but her heart remained tethered to the American senator. She kept his letters like sacred relics, proof that the magic in Cannes had been real. In August 1955, the fantasy was finally willed into reality. Jack was ostensibly traveling to Europe for official business and rest, but his true compass was set for the north. He left Jackie behind in the United States. He slipped away from his entourage, from the press, and from the suffocating expectations of his office. He traveled to Sweden, a country that offered him the ultimate luxury for a man of his fame: anonymity. The reunion took place in Bostad, a picturesque resort town on the Swedish coast, known for its clay tennis courts, its bracing sea air, and its discretion. It was a place where the wealthy went to be invisible. When Gunilla saw him again, 2 years had passed. She was 23 now, no longer the wide-eyed girl of 21, but a woman with a more grounded sense of self. Jack was 38, thinner, his face etched with the lines of the chronic pain he endured, but his eyes were alive with anticipation. The moment they met, the years of separation evaporated. It wasn't just a physical attraction, though that was undeniable. It was a profound sense of relief. Gunilla later described the reunion as a return home. For Jack, stepping off the train or plane into the cool, crisp Swedish air was like stepping out of a furnace. Here, there were no voters to please. There was no father watching his every move. There was only Gunilla. They checked into a hotel, likely the historic Skånegården, a place of rustic elegance with timbered walls and roaring fireplaces. For one glorious, impossible week, they lived a lie that felt more true than their real lives. They existed as a couple. They were, for all intents and purposes, Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy in a parallel universe. What seduced Jack in Sweden was not just the romance, it was the banality. For the first time in his adult life, Jack Kennedy was allowed to be boring. There were no bodyguards. There were no reporters documenting his choice of tie. In Båstad, he did things that would have been impossible in Hyannisport. He went grocery shopping with Gunilla. He sat on a park bench and watched the ducks. He was fascinated by the simplicity of a life where his biggest decision was what to order for dinner, not how to vote on a bill. Gunilla later recalled watching him sleep during that week. Without the back brace, without the political mask, he looked younger, softer. The lines of pain around his eyes seemed to smooth out. He was playing house, indulging in a fantasy of normalcy that he knew deep down he could never afford. He told her he wanted a boat. He wanted to sail around the archipelagos of Scandinavia with her, far away from the Senate floor. It was a child's dream, whispered by a man who was about to become the most powerful leader on earth. The days were spent in a rhythm of domestic intimacy that Jack had never really known. They walked hand in hand through the pine forests, the soft needles dampening the sound of their footsteps. They rented a car and drove through the rolling countryside of Skåne, stopping at small village inns where no one recognized the senator from Massachusetts. They were just a handsome American tourist and his beautiful Swedish girlfriend. They laughed. They ate simple meals of herring and potatoes. They drank wine by the fire as the Nordic twilight lingered late into the evening. But the intimacy went deeper than romantic dinners. In the privacy of their room, the reality of Jack's physical condition was laid bare. Without his back brace, Jack was often helpless. There were mornings when the pain was so searing he could not bend down to tie his own shoes or pull on his socks. Gunilla became his nurse. With a tenderness that Jack had never experienced from the ambitious people in his orbit, she would kneel before him, gently helping him dress, soothing his spasms with warm towels. This act of service shifted something fundamental in Jack's heart. In Washington, his pain was a secret to be hidden, a weakness that political sharks would smell blood in. With Gunilla, his pain was accepted. She didn't look away from his scars, she touched them. For a man who had to project an image of vigor, and youth to the world, the freedom to be broken, to be weak and still be loved, was the most intoxicating drug of all. It was during this week that the affair was consummated, but to reduce it to a sexual tryst is to miss the point entirely. This was an emotional consummation. Jack let his guard down completely. He allowed Gunilla to see his scars, the angry red zipper of a scar running down his back from the surgery. He let her see his frailty. He didn't have to be the war hero with her. He could just be a man who hurt. And Gunilla, with her nurturing, stoic Swedish nature, did not recoil. She loved him not in spite of his weakness, but because she saw the human being struggling beneath the armor. The intimacy of that week in Båstad created a dangerous clarity in Jack's mind. The contrast between the peace he felt with Gunilla and the frantic, high-pressure existence he led in Washington was stark. He began to delude himself, or perhaps he began to see clearly for the first time, that he could change the script, the presidency, the power, the legacy. Suddenly, in the arms of this woman, it all seemed like a heavy coat he wanted to take off. The climax of this week, and indeed the climax of their entire relationship, came one evening as they sat together, the silence of the Swedish night wrapping around them. The playfulness was gone from Jack's face. He looked at Gunilla with a terrifying seriousness. The Swedish guerrilla jokes were put aside. This was John F. Kennedy, the strategist, making a move. "I want to leave, Jackie," he told her. The words were soft, but they hit with the force of a bomb. Gunilla stared at him. This wasn't the whisper of a lover in the heat of passion. This was a statement of intent. "I want to marry you," he continued. "I want to have a life with you." Gunilla was stunned. She knew he was unhappy, but divorce? In 1955? For a Catholic politician? It was unheard of. It was political suicide. It was the kind of scandal that ended careers before they even peaked. She asked him about the consequences. She asked him about his career, his family, the church. Jack was not naive. He knew the obstacles. But in the euphoria of Båstad, he believed he could overcome them. He believed that his happiness mattered. He believed that if he presented his case to the one man who controlled his destiny, his father, Joe Kennedy, he could win. He thought he could trade the White House for Gunilla. "I will talk to my father," Jack promised. "He wants me to be happy. He will understand." It was a heartbreaking display of optimism from a man who usually operated on cold calculation. It showed just how deeply he had fallen. He was willing to dismantle the entire Kennedy machine for the sake of the woman sitting across from him. He painted a picture of their future, a quiet life, perhaps in academia, perhaps in diplomacy, but a life together. He asked Gunilla to wait for him. He asked her to trust him. Gunilla, overwhelmed by love and the sheer magnitude of what he was proposing, said yes. She would wait. She would be his wife if he could free himself. As the week drew to a close, the air in Båstad grew heavy with the impending separation. The honeymoon was over. The real world was calling. Jack had to return to the United States. He had to return to the Senate, to Jackie, and to the formidable Joseph P. Kennedy. He was leaving Sweden with a plan that would rock the foundations of American politics. They said goodbye with the desperate clinging of two people who are being pulled apart by a current they cannot control. Jack boarded his plane, his heart full of hope, and his mind racing with arguments to present to his father. Gunilla stood on the ground, watching him disappear into the clouds. She went back to her apartment in Stockholm, her life now suspended in a state of agonizing waiting. She was no longer just a girlfriend. She was the woman who was waiting for the king to abdicate his throne. The week in Sweden was the high water mark of their love. It was the moment when the impossible seemed possible. But as Jack flew west across the Atlantic, he was flying straight into the teeth of a power far greater than love. He was flying home to ask permission to be human, and he was about to learn that in the Kennedy family, humanity was a liability. The idyllic dream of Båstad was about to collide with the brutal reality of Hyannisport. When John F. Kennedy landed back on American soil in late August 1955, he was a man possessed by a singular, dangerous idea. The air of Sweden was still in his lungs. The memory of Gunilla was stamped on his retina. He walked with a lighter step despite his ailing back because for the first time in his life he believed he had found a way out of the labyrinth his father had built for him. He believed he could rewrite the ending of his own story. But Jack was suffering from a fatal misconception. He thought he was the author of his life. He was about to be reminded that he was merely the protagonist in a script written by Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. The Kennedy family dynamic was not a democracy, it was a monarchy, and Joe Kennedy was the absolute ruler. He had amassed a fortune, served as ambassador to the United Kingdom, and now, having seen his own political ambitions thwarted and his eldest son killed in the war, he had poured every ounce of his formidable will into Jack. Jack was the vessel. Jack was the investment. And in the high-stakes world of 1950s politics, an investment like that had to be protected at all costs. Jack did not go to Jackie with his request for a divorce. He knew she was not the decision-maker. He went straight to the source of power. He traveled to the family compound, or perhaps he made the call from the privacy of his Senate office. The historical record is quiet on the location, but the content of the conversation reverberates through history. He picked up the phone to call the patriarch. One can only imagine the tension in Jack's hand as he held the receiver. He was a war hero who had saved his crew in the Pacific. He was a United States senator. But in the presence of his father, he was often reduced to a boy seeking approval. He laid out his case. He spoke of his unhappiness. He spoke of Gunilla, of her grace, her lineage, her ability to give him the peace he so desperately craved. He told his father he wanted a divorce. He told him he wanted to marry the Swedish aristocrat. But the request collided with a force far more rigid than romantic love, the ghost of a dead brother. Jack was never supposed to be the politician. That role belonged to his older brother, Joe Kennedy Jr., the golden child, the star athlete, the designated heir to the presidency. But Joe Jr. had exploded in a plane over the English Channel during the war. When the smoke cleared, the mantle of ambition fell onto Jack's frail shoulders. Jack wasn't just living his own life, he was living the unfulfilled timeline of a dead war hero. In the eyes of his father, Jack was a substitute player who had been subbed in to win the game. For the substitute to suddenly demand personal happiness, to demand a divorce and a foreign wife, was not just rebellion. It was a desecration of his brother's sacrifice. The weight on the phone line wasn't just parental authority. It was the crushing guilt of a survivor who owes a debt he can never repay. On the other end of the line, there was likely a silence that felt colder than the Swedish winter. When Joe Kennedy finally spoke, it wasn't with the empathy of a father. It was with the ruthlessness of a political boss. He did not shout. He did not need to. He simply laid out the calculus of power. "You're out of your mind," Joe likely said, or words to that effect. The argument he presented was unassailable in its logic. Jack was a Catholic. In 1955, the prejudice against Catholics in America was still a potent political force. No Catholic had ever been elected president. The only way Jack could overcome that barrier was by being perfect, by being the ideal family man, by presenting an image of moral unimpeachability. "Divorce is not an option," Joe decreed. A divorced Catholic? It was an oxymoron in the eyes of the electorate. It was political suicide. If Jack divorced Jackie, the Catholic vote, the bedrock of the Democratic base, would evaporate. The press would savage him. The dream of the White House would be over before the campaign even started. But Joe didn't stop at politics. He hit Jack where it truly hurt: the legacy. He reminded Jack of his dead brother, Joe Jr., the golden boy who was supposed to be president. He reminded Jack of the millions of dollars already spent, the deals already cut, the machinery already in motion. To throw it all away for a woman, For a foreigner, it was selfish. It was a betrayal of the family. "You will stay married," Joe ordered. "You will be president, and you will forget this girl." The verdict was final. There was no court of appeals in the Kennedy family. Across the ocean in Stockholm, Gunilla von Post was waiting. She sat by the telephone in her apartment, her life on hold. Every time it rang, her heart jumped. She had spent the week since Bostad dreaming of her life in America, of being the wife of the man she loved. Finally, the call came. Jack's voice when he spoke was unrecognizable. It was hollow, drained of the vitality that had defined him in Sweden. It was the voice of a defeated man. "He said no," Jack whispered. The three words hung in the air, traversing the thousands of miles of wire and water to land like stones in Gunilla's heart. "I can't do it, Gunilla," he continued. "I can't ruin my career. I can't let my father down." He tried to explain the political realities, the Catholic issue, the electoral math. But to Gunilla, it just sounded like an excuse. It sounded like a choice. And it was. Jack was choosing the crowd over her. He was choosing the applause of strangers over the intimacy of their love. In a desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage, Jack made a suggestion that revealed the depth of his moral confusion. He proposed that they could continue the affair. He suggested that Gunilla could come to America, perhaps work as a model or a secretary, and be near him. He wanted to keep her as a mistress while staying married to Jackie. He wanted to have it both ways, the classic Kennedy solution to the problem of desire. But he had miscalculated Gunilla's character. She was not a starlet looking for a benefactor. She was a Von Post. She had pride. She had dignity. "I will not be the other woman," she told him, her voice trembling but firm. "I will not live in the shadows." She understood in that moment that the Jack she loved, the man in the blue sweater in Bostad, was gone. He had been swallowed whole by the senator. He had made his deal with the devil. "If you cannot marry me," she said, "then we must say goodbye." The conversation ended. The line went dead. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on a future that would never happen. Jack hung up the phone in America, trapped in his golden cage. He had the presidency ahead of him, yes. He would have the glory, the fame, the history books. But he had just traded away the one thing that made him feel real. Gunilla sat in the silence of her Stockholm apartment. She did not weep immediately. The shock was too great. She had been so close to a different life. She had touched it. And now it was gone, vetoed by an old man in Hyannisport she had never even met. This was the turning point. This was the moment the die was cast. Jack Kennedy would go on to become the icon of an era, the symbol of hope for a generation. But the man inside the suit was now hollowed out. He had learned the hardest lesson of power. It requires the sacrifice of the self. He had sacrificed Gunilla, and in doing so, he had sealed his own fate. The Camelot that would follow was built on the ruins of this rejection. It was a kingdom of style over substance, of image over emotion. The love affair was technically over, but the ghosts of what happened in 1955 would haunt them both for the rest of their lives. Jack had chosen the crown. Now he would have to bear its weight, but fate had one final cruel twist in store for them. 3 years later, in 1958, Gunilla traveled to New York. Jack, hearing she was in the city, arranged a meeting at the Waldorf Astoria. By now, Gunilla was married to a wealthy landowner, and Jack was running for president. The dynamic had shifted. When they met in the corridor of the hotel, the air was thick with things unsaid. Jack looked tired. The spark of the Riviera was dimmer, replaced by the hard, polished veneer of a career politician. He took her hand, and for a fleeting moment the years fell away. He told her he was happy she had found someone. He told her she looked beautiful. But then He asked a question that revealed the depth of his lingering obsession. "Are you happy?" he asked. "Is it quiet?" He wasn't asking about her husband. He was asking about the peace he had tasted in Sweden. Gunilla nodded. Jack smiled, a sad, resigned smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Wonderful," he whispered. "I envy you." They parted ways in the lobby, two ships passing in the night for the very last time. He walked out to his waiting limousine and the flashbulbs. She walked back into anonymity. He had chosen the noise. She had kept the silence. Then came November 22nd, 1963. The news traveled across the Atlantic like a shock wave. Gunilla was in Sweden when the broadcast interrupted the regular programming. President Kennedy has been shot. While the world mourned a leader, Gunilla had to mourn in secret. She could not wear black. She could not wail in public. She could not call Jackie to offer condolences. She was a woman locked in a glass box of grief. She had to sit at her dinner table, maintaining the facade of a polite Swedish wife, while inside, her heart was breaking for the boy in the blue sweater. She took out the letters she had promised to destroy but never could, and read them one last time. "If I had met you 1 week earlier," the sentence now read like an epitaph. The bullet in Dallas had killed the president, but the tragedy of Jack Kennedy had begun long before, on the day he decided that power was worth more than love. On a quiet day in 2011, in the warmth of the Florida sun, Gunilla von Post took her final breath. She was 79 years old. To the nurses who attended her, she was a polite elderly woman with a fading accent and a gentle demeanor. To the world, she was a footnote in a history book. But as she slipped away, she took with her the last living memory of the man the world called Mr. President, but whom she had simply called Jack. Her death marked the final curtain call of a drama that had begun nearly 60 years earlier in the jazz-filled air of the French Riviera. With her passing, the story of the Swedish guerrilla and the American prince moved entirely from the realm of memory into the realm of legend. But unlike the other legends surrounding the Kennedy name, stories of mafia dons, movie stars, and political brinksmanship, Gunilla's legacy offers something far more haunting. It offers us a glimpse of the alternate timeline, the ghostly possibility of a world that never was. As we stand at the end of this journey looking back at the wreckage of these two lives, we are forced to confront the most painful question in history: what if? It is a seductive exercise to imagine that parallel universe. In that world, there is no President Kennedy. There is no motorcade in Dallas. There is no eternal flame at Arlington. Instead, Jack is perhaps a university professor or a writer living by the sea, far from his father's thumb. Gunilla is there. They are aging together, watching their children grow. They are ordinary, they are obscure, and most importantly, they are alive. By choosing the path of power, Jack Kennedy gained the crown but lost the man inside the suit. Gunilla offered him a lifeline, an exit ramp from the highway to destruction. When she begged him to choose her, she wasn't just asking for his heart. Unknowingly, she was trying to save his life. Gunilla was the collateral damage of a great man's ambition. She spent her youth waiting for a phone call that never came, and her old age guarding a secret the world was not ready to hear. She was the queen who never was. Yet there is a strange victory in her life. While history claimed the president, Gunilla kept the man. She preserved the soul of John F. Kennedy, while the world consumed his image. The story of Gunilla von Post dismantles the shiny facade of Camelot. It reveals that the perfect marriage was a construct of state, and that the happy warrior was a man deeply conflicted, torn between the duty he was bred for and the freedom he craved. When the end came in Dallas, silenced by the roar of a rifle, one has to wonder where his final thoughts drifted. Did he think of the political victories? Or did his mind return to the scent of pine needles in Sweden, to the girl in the blue dress, and to the life he was too afraid to choose. In the end, Gunilla von Post was the only woman who offered him a life, not a legacy, and the tragedy remains that he couldn't afford the price of her love.